Welcome to spiritualitystepbystep.com. My name is Dan Wigner, and I'd like to talk to you today about spiritual or mystical experiences. Specifically, what to do once you've had a spiritual or mystical experience. To talk about that, I'd like to point out on my website, spiritualitystepbystep.com, that you can see I have a whole category for spiritual experiences. If you click there and scroll down a bit, you will see I have first talked about what is a spiritual experience. I'm not going to talk as much about that today, and I have a different video linked there where you can see it says Anatomy of a Mystical Experience, in which I go in depth into what a mystical experience is. Today, I'd like to talk to you about mystical reflection. Mystical reflection is a method, a small group method I've devised on how to talk fruitfully about the spiritual or mystical experiences that you've had with others. Typically, when you've had such an experience, you might think about, well, personally, what do I do with this? How do I interpret it? And there are a lot of avenues for going about that. And I would definitely recommend, and you can see linked on the website there, is spiritual direction. To have a seasoned and experienced spiritual director to help you interpret is a very good tool to have. But let's say that whether you don't have a spiritual director available to you, or you have some idea of the meaning of the spiritual experience for yourself, but you don't want to keep it to yourself. I found in my own personal research and talking to many people who've had mystical experiences that typically they kind of either go one of two avenues when they try to share that experience. They share that experience and they're met with silence, or, well, that's good for you. That kind of response of other people don't know exactly what to do with that kind of story. Or that other person takes that as a jumping off point to share their own story. Or what has happened in many, many cases that I've dealt with is that person takes the sharing of a story as the invitation to interpret that experience for the person who had it. And since all of those approaches don't really get at the point of a spiritual experience that can actually help others to grow spiritually, as well as the person who's had it, I've created this method to have some setting for how spiritual experiences can directly grow spirituality in a group. So mystical reflection is essentially a blend, for a small group of two different spiritual practices, which I also have described and linked on my website here and described in my book, Just Begin, a source book of spiritual practices. I blend Lectio Divina and centering prayer in a small group setting so that the people around the person who has the mystical experience can, rather than try to interpret it for that person, to reflect on it and learn from it. And you can see I've set that up into 8 different steps that basically what you would do as a group is gather, take some time to settle into the space, a little bit, to build a little bit of a sense of quiet or difference from everyday life, to kind of relax from the day, that sort of thing. And then open the time of reflection with a prayer for guidance. Just a short prayer to help everybody get on the same page as far as why they're there and what they're going to do. Then for that particular session, one person has been selected. Usually they know in advance, or they should know in advance, to share a mystical experience. Or the group may decide to all reflect on a mystical experience found in sacred scripture or a book, a spiritual book that they have, or even a video where they've all decided to reflect on this experience that none of them have had. So you don't necessarily have to have someone in the group who's had a recent experience. But through either a reading, a watching, or a telling, there's a first hearing of that mystical experience. And then rather than immediately saying anything, then a short time of centering prayer, not at this time with any of the content from the experience, with the sacred word or phrase that those in the group have used before. After that centering prayer period, the story is told again. And this time, each one is listening for some word or image or phrase that's brought up in their minds. And sometimes it might seem quite unrelated to the mystical experience itself. After that second telling, there is a second prayer period in which that image or word or phrase is now what is used as the sacred word, as the focus of the centering prayer time. Following that centering prayer time, and kind of that going back and forth between centering prayer and hearing of the mystical experience, there's a sharing time, not of the interpretation of the experience, to reinterpret it for the person who had it, but of what touched them about that particular experience, what they learned, where it took their own mind or their own spirit. And usually with with everyone having a chance to share with the person who actually had the experience at the end, giving any kind of interpretation or additional kind of history of how that experience has affected their life. Following that, there's an ending time of prayer for guidance and parting of the group, which can be long or short depending on how your group would work. Now, and that's the method, those 8 steps. But there's a lot of more description and setup for that. And part of the reason that I'm talking to you today is I have a new book coming out called Thinking Spiritually, The Practice of Group Mystical Reflection from Cascade Books. And that book will go into much more detail about this method. But I offer this method for small groups to use because for mystical experiences of actually meeting the divine and the spiritual to directly grow one's faith. And even if you didn't have that experience, that someone else having that experience could grow your faith in a direct way. So you'll see this video and others linked on my website. I'm also will link when that book is fully published. I'll link the information for buying that book, and I also am available for workshops and seminars to teach this method, to illustrate it, with actual groups. So, thank you for your time, and let's get to reflecting.